I'm standing here up to my thighs in digital water from the hit 2003 video game Morrowind, and I'm a little confused because the game refers to this water as a river, but if you look closely, it's not going anywhere. Come here. This water is totally stagnant, and I don't know if you know this, but rivers aren't stagnant. They move, or they're supposed to. Now, I wasn't even planning on doing a video on the rivers of Morrowind, because on the map they all look very short and boring. But once I noticed this little detail of the water not moving, I got curious, and then I started trying to map out all the rivers. And in doing that, I noticed some other weird little things, and then I started doing some research, and pretty soon I had become totally convinced Morrowind doesn't have any rivers. These aren't rivers, but if they aren't rivers, what are they? So the first thing I want to do is follow this river to its source and see what we find out. It's pretty straightforward. We'll start here in the city of Balmora and we'll head north along the shores of the river. I'm gonna do that a lot. The river basically meanders straight in this direction for a few minutes before coming to an end right here. And as you can see, it's not much. It's significantly less detailed than the sources of rivers in Zelda and Skyrim, which is a super fun comparison. But before I show you that, I do, of course, have to do a sponsored segment. Actually, you know what? I'll show you it and then do the sponsored segment after. Okay, so look at this. Compared to Skyrim's rivers, Morrowind's rivers are really sparse. Skyrim has beautiful, like contributing streams and whitewater rapids and these giant waterfalls that make the environment feel really alive and really wet. I like looking at this little side by side because I think it's cool to see how far Bethesda came in just 8 short years between the two games, which is actually kind of crazy if you think about it. Zelda's rivers are also more detailed than Morrowind's, and they do have directional flow, but you can find some small spots in that game that are a little bit similar to Morrowind and how sparse they are. We love that. You know what we also love? What is it again? Rocket money. I do like rocket money. This will be easy. My pitch for rocket money is simple. Y'all are gonna hate me for this because I'm gonna sound like your dad, but my pitch is this, and I mean it. You don't actually have money until you have a budget. Period. Budgeting is the lamest, like most annoying, most negative aura activity ever, but unironically, when I started budgeting, my life got like 30% less stressful. And Rocket Money makes the activity of budgeting really straightforward and really transparent. I've used a lot of budgeting apps, and this one is top tier. That's not a joke. If you're smart enough to play Morrowind, you're smart enough to budget your money. You have no excuse. You know you should be doing it. If you need encouragement, comment down below and I'll give you encouragement. But one thing that's new for me is how Rocket Money does that thing where they find all the things you're subscribed to and then they list them so you can see if you're wasting money on anything. I used to roll my eyes at services like this because I figured if I'm smart enough to budget, I'm smart enough to cancel unused subscriptions. But like with all good expressions of great hubris, I was completely wrong. So that was nice to see. So yeah, I'm down with Rocket Money. And now I have to read a few lines verbatim because that's how this works. And then we'll be back to Morrowind. To save more and spend less, join the over 5 million members, that's a lot, using Rocket Money today. Go to rocketmoney.com/AnyAustin or click the link in the description to get started for free. You can also unlock even more features with it with premium. That's rocketmoney.com/AnyAustin to get started for free. That's me. I'm Any Austin. Along this river, there really isn't much to see. Unlike Skyrim, there are no waterfalls, no streams, no rapids. It's just still water being still. At this point, I was considering the idea that this just counted as a really weirdly shaped lake, but it turns out when we start to look towards where this water connects with the ocean, there will be some more compelling evidence that this is neither a river nor a lake, nor a creek, nor a pond. It's actually probably something that I'd never even heard of before, but it makes a lot of sense for Morrowind's geology. So let's get through this bit so I can start talking to you about that. The only thing I want us to hold on to from this section of the river is this bit right here. You see how the water just pushes up in a different direction for no reason? If we're meant to believe that the river is flowing like this, there's no real way for that water to end up going that way. That's just not really how rivers work. Keep this in mind because it's going to be relevant a little bit later on. Continuing south past the city of Balmora, the way we get from the river to the sea is just as simple as the way we get from the river to its source. It's just a big straight line. Honestly, these whole rivers, they're not even worth diagramming really because there's no flow, but if you want to see it, this is what it would look like. Not exactly the most exciting thing in the world. Compare that to the one we made of Hyrule. Big difference. Just like the other part that we explored, there's also just not much going on down here. No real features to speak of, no other connecting rivers, nothing, no flow. It's just a glorified, blurry puddle of mud. But you know what? What if we're thinking about this all wrong? We've come into this exercise, especially because of the other 2 videos we made about rivers, assuming that this must be a river and looking for indicators proving that assumption. But what if instead of presupposing that this is a river and then just looking for confirming evidence, we actually ask ourselves, What is this? What are we actually looking at here? So let's state that very plainly, right? We have a long, narrow, stagnant body of water with no discernible flow, wherein all that water is the same altitude, presumably sea level, and wherein that water connects directly to the ocean. Now, if we take this set of facts and we start looking for examples of things like this on Earth using the World Wide Web, would we find anything that might fit? Well, let's take it one thing at a time. Number one, is there such a thing as a naturally occurring body of water that doesn't flow anywhere? There's some obvious ones like lakes and ponds, but some other good candidates are estuaries, oxbow lakes, lagoons, marshes and swamps, sloughs and tidal canals. Now, I don't have to tell you guys, I'm a damn fool. I'm not a hydrologist. I have no education in hydrology, so all of these things probably have a bunch of overlap with one another and may even be terms that don't actually make sense in the context that I use them. If you're an expert, we welcome your corrections down below because we love to learn. This is the only disclaimer you're going to get in this video. Now, the next thing we have to look for is a body of water that's long and skinny. Lakes and ponds generally aren't long and skinny. I know they can be, but just trust me, it's not going to be relevant, so we're going to count them out. But oxbow lakes, which are old sections of rivers that get bypassed by a more efficient route, are long and skinny, so we're going to keep them. Estuaries are often stagnant, but they aren't usually long and skinny because they're formed in places where rivers meet the sea. Lagoons generally aren't long and skinny, and neither are marshes or swamps, but tidal canals and sloughs, we'll define those later if need be, are. Now, if we're looking at something that has the same elevation across the whole spread, all of these will qualify because by necessity, if the elevation changed going across the area, then the water is not going to be stagnant. It's going to flow, which would turn it into a river. And then lastly, we need a body of water that connects directly to the ocean. All of these, except the oxbow lake and the lagoon, can, in the right circumstances, connect directly to the ocean. So the only one that qualifies on all fronts is tidal canals and sloughs, which for our purposes, those two things are basically the same thing. So going forward, I'm just going to call them sloughs because it's more fun to say. Now, this word is apparently both defined and pronounced differently depending on the region of the world that you're in. And it can either be said as slough, slough, or if you're English, first of all, sorry, but if you're English, slough. I'm going to go with the most common pronunciation of slough because that's how they say it on the west coast of the United States, and we're going to be using a lot of west coast examples later in the video. So what is a slough? You can kind of think of a slough as just like a thin, stagnant body of water that's usually connected to some other body of water. They can take on a lot of different forms in real life, so it'll probably just be easiest if I show you a few so you can get the feel for what we're talking about. This is Vancouver. It's in a place called Canada. This is Finn Slough, which is located just off the Fraser River in downtown Vancouver. The river flows this way and the slough gets its water from this direction, but it's just a stagnant little offshoot of the main river. Now I can hear you saying, this does not look at all like what we have in Morrowind. Correct. An even better example of this, and one that does look a lot more like what we're looking at in Morrowind, is the South Slough in Oregon. This water that you see is all just water that gets pushed inland during high tide, and then it just sits there or very slowly drains back out during low tide. Look how far inland it gets. If you didn't know any better, if you looked at these, you would think these were rivers flowing into the ocean, but they aren't. They're sloughs. Sloughs. So this is kind of what I'm arguing might be happening with this river in Morrowind. Maybe at some point in the past there was a little baby stream that flowed here which carved out the channel itself, but then something changed geologically and water started pushing in from the ocean, stagnating the river and creating a slough. Sloughs can also form as really long offshoots of active rivers. Take this area just inland of San Francisco called Grizzly Bay. You've got a bunch of weird bulbous areas, you've got some sloughs, and then you still have that active river flowing into the area. Spots like this are ripe for complicated hydrological features to form, and if we go just a little further east in Morrowind, we can find something that bears some resemblance to this. So here's this other river in Morrowind. This river does start at a lake technically, but if we start to look towards the sea, the path the water follows gets a little confusing. How is the water flowing this way, but also this way and this way? Or is it flowing this way? And also, what's going on down here? Well, as we just learned, maybe this is actually a slough, and these are bays. And this is still sort of an active river, but the competing forces of the tides going in and the river flowing out has largely stagnated the flow and created this big complicated mess of water. I like this explanation. It's actually starting to sound like such a good explanation for everything that I'm getting a little skeptical of it, and I feel like I should probably do some oppositional research. Maybe. But first, the only thing our story here is really missing is a good explanation for why these rivers rivers would have stopped flowing enough to keep the ocean out, or why the tides would have suddenly become strong enough to overpower the rivers. In real life, this can happen in various ways, such as is the case with the Elkhorn Slough in California. A tectonic shift actually cut the river off from its original source in the Elkhorn Mountains, which meant that the river was no longer strong enough to keep the ocean out, and so the ocean came in, creating a very complex and diverse ecosystem, including many sloughs. And you want to know what's fucking crazy about this? Sorry for cursing, I know you hate it, but you want to know what's bonkers about this? The only reason we know that Elkhorn Slough was created because of this geological event is because one guy decided to figure it out in 1983 as part of his doctoral thesis. One guy, shout out David Lee Schwartz. You never know when your very specific niche paper is going to come in handy, possibly 40 years in the future for someone who's trying to figure out how rivers from a video game 20 years in the past came to be. This guy, David Lee Schwartz, actually now works trying to get plastic out of the ocean as part of a charity. So if you have an extra $5 and you want to show appreciation to the work that he made to help make this video possible, I'll put a link to donate to the charity in the description. As far as the rivers here are concerned, all we need to prove now is that there was some sort of similar tectonic event in Morrowind's past that could explain why these rivers were suddenly unable to be rivers anymore. If you look down below, you'll see that the Morrowind nerds, which does include me, have already commented that this game is set on an island that's occupied by a giant volcano, and yes, they're correct. And that's very convenient for our hydrogeological headcanon, which is a phrase that no one has ever said before. Having that volcano is going to give us a convenient way to explain how this area might have changed, thus allowing that seawater to flow inland. Here's a picture of the island of Vardenfell, which is where Morrowind is set. If you zoom out to see the whole continent, you can see that it sits in the northeast surrounded by a sort of narrow sea. So the water that I've been calling the ocean is technically not really an ocean, but that's fine. Keep this picture in your head. Let me tell you a story. 74,000 years ago, a part of the earth exploded, aka a volcano erupted in Indonesia. It was really bad. The site of that eruption looks like this today. Now let's compare that to Vardenfell. Very interesting. This isn't super common, but it is the case that when volcanic eruptions are extremely violent, they can cause complex craters to form, and those complex craters sometimes fill with water, leaving only the original volcanic peak at the center, which creates an island. In the case of the one in Singapore, this center island is very large. It's nearly 30 kilometers across, and the surrounding crater was filled in from various water sources like rivers, rains, and groundwater. In Morrowind, the surrounding water has filled in directly from the ocean, which isn't as common. But there is one decent example of this in real life in Italy. You can see how some kind of eruption blasted away most of the land, leaving a smaller island in the middle. Neither of these areas are perfect examples of what's in Morrowind, but it's close enough that I feel good about rolling with it. So my story, as it stands, is basically that a long time ago, Morrowind was all one big landmass. On that landmass were a series of lakes and rivers that flowed in a variety of ways, but then one day, there was a big explosion from the mountain. This explosion was so sufficiently violent as to separate the island of Vardenfell from the mainland, causing a breach where ocean water flowed inward, creating this sea. The flow of that ocean water was strong enough, especially during high tide, to exert enough opposite pressure on the now severed rivers and streams to negate the flow entirely, creating a brackish mix of fresh and salt water, and turning these once beloved rivers into nothing more than murky, stagnant sloughs. So in light of all of this information, I stand before you to restate my initial thesis. Morrowind doesn't have any rivers. It's pretty convincing, right? Almost too convincing. So let's take some time and consider a counter-argument. Unfortunately, a lot of what we've talked about, while it's all grounded in individual concepts that do happen and are possible, it's probably impossible to have them occur on a volcanic island like Vardenfell for a variety of reasons. Firstly, volcanic islands tend to be really steep due to how they form, and if there are rivers on them, those rivers run fast because the land is, again, very steep on account of being a volcano. Notice that Hawaii has some rivers, but Hawaii does not have any sloughs because seawater can't just climb upwards, hundreds of feet. Additionally, you also need a ton of rainfall to have rivers of any kind on a volcanic island, because if you don't, those rivers are going to run dry pretty quickly because they flow pretty quickly. This isn't necessarily disqualifying because some regions in Morrowind are known for being very rainy, but a lot of the regions that are rainy aren't near the regions where those bodies of water would have initially formed. It's entirely possible that the volcanic eruption disrupted the climate of the area, so we'll call it a wash, but I just figured it was worth mentioning. Speaking of that disastrous eruption we theorized about, one thing I didn't tell you was that if this whole situation was caused by an explosion on the level of the one that formed the island in Indonesia, it would have completely obliterated Morrowind, like completely. An explosion big enough to make a rift that breaks the continent apart and strong enough to move oceans into forming a new sea would also be sufficiently big as to call a mulligan for the geology of the entire island. So, I kind of buried the lead on that one for you. I know, it's disappointing to create a really fun headcanon backed up by real hydrology and geology, only to then completely dismantle it using the same hydrology and geology. But guess what? We live in reality. Just because we're making a video essay on YouTube doesn't mean we can ignore valid information that contradicts our original thesis. If reality is murky, we must do our best to present that murkiness in all its beauty. You know what they say, don't call it a spade if it isn't a spade, and don't call it a river if it's a slough. Oh, yeah. One final thing. I know I just spent some time dismantling the entire idea of these being sloughs and undoing my entire argument, but I wanted to show you something really interesting that I found while playing Morrowind for the first time. Down near the mouth of the first river we discussed, the really straight one that runs through Balmora, you'll find a swampy area full of little islands. On these islands are lots of plants you can collect for using in crafting potions or cooking, whatever. There are mushrooms like Bungler's Bane, and one of these plants can only be found down here in this area near the mouth of that river we talked about, and that plant has a very peculiar name. Huh. Ain't that something? I'm Annie Austin. Thanks for watching.